The Dark Obsession. True crime meets fiction in a chilling tale. Hook. Have you ever wondered what happens when you dive too deep into a true crime story? What if you became part of it? Watch as one woman's obsession with a mysterious book spirals into a nightmare that no one could escape. This isn't just fiction. It's a story that writes itself, and you're about to be caught in it. Stay tuned, because the chilling truth will keep you on the edge of your seat until the very end. The room smelled of stale air. Dust clung to the edges of the windows. Outside, the night was pitch black. The streetlights hummed weakly, casting faint, uneven shadows. Inside, Marissa stood still. She felt something wasn't right. The silence was too heavy, too suffocating. Her fingers traced the worn edge of the book she had been reading. True crime. The stories of the dead, of the killers, of the mysteries. She could never get enough. It was all she thought about. But tonight, something felt off. A sound broke the silence. A soft shuffle, almost like footsteps. Her heart skipped. She turned sharply toward the door. Nothing. She exhaled, trying to shake off the unease. She was alone, or so she thought. The shuffle came again, closer this time. Marissa's breath caught in her throat. Her mind raced. No one could be here. The windows were locked. The door was bolted shut. She pulled her knees to her chest, gripping the book tighter. Her pulse was erratic. The air in the room thickened. Each second felt like an eternity. Then came the knock, a slow, deliberate tap. At the window, her head snapped in that direction. A shadow moved beyond the glass. Her hands trembled. She didn't move. The figure outside stopped. It lingered, waiting. Marissa tried to swallow her fear. She grabbed the phone. Her fingers hovered over the screen. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Suddenly, the window creaked open. She couldn't stop herself. She gasped. The figure stepped inside. The room seemed to freeze. Her eyes locked with those of the stranger. And in that instant, she knew. The story wasn't over. It had just begun. The stranger's eyes were cold, empty. They bore into hers like a predator sizing up its prey. Marissa tried to speak, but her voice was gone. Her throat was dry, as though all the air had been sucked out of the room. The figure took a step closer, then another. Closer. The floor creaked beneath its weight. Her chest tightened. Her heart thudded in her ears. She could barely breathe now. The figure's lips curled into a slight smile. It wasn't comforting. It was unnerving. Marissa's fingers trembled, still gripping the phone. But she couldn't move it. Couldn't press the button. The stranger stopped. Right in front of her. The silence was suffocating. A beat. Another. Then the figure reached into the pocket of its dark coat. Her eyes widened. What was it going to do? A small object appeared in its hand. A knife, gleaming under the faint light. Her stomach churned. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The figure leaned in. Its breath was cold against her ear. Stories, it whispered, are never just stories. Marissa felt her body stiffen. The hairs on her neck stood on end. The knife glinted, the edge catching the low light. Her entire body screamed to move, to run, but her limbs wouldn't obey. The figure watched her unmoving, as if savoring the fear in her eyes. Every second stretched out in a twisted eternity. The book in her lap, the one she had been reading just moments ago, seemed miles away now. The page she had left open, the case she'd been following, it felt like a dark omen. Like this moment had been written long ago. Marissa's pulse quickened. The figure leaned closer. Do you want to know how it ends? Her breath caught. Then, without warning, it reached down and snatched the book from her hands, flipped it open to the last page. A single sentence stared back at her. Asterisk, the truth is always darker than the fiction. Asterisk. And in that instant, Everything went black, darkness swallowed her whole. The silence was deafening. Her heartbeat was the only sound she could hear. Thud, thud, thud. It felt as if the air itself had disappeared. She gasped, trying to force air into her lungs, but none came. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. Her limbs were heavy, pinned to the spot. A cold draft brushed against her skin. Then a soft voice, closer this time, whispered in the dark. "It's already too late." Marissa's throat tightened, her mind scrambling to make sense of what was happening. Her eyes strained against the dark, trying to find anything familiar. Her hands, she tried to raise them, but they wouldn't budge. The coldness, it was deeper now, almost suffocating. A sound shattered the stillness. A quick scraping, like nails against the floor. She froze. The sound grew louder, closer. She felt the presence again, that suffocating weight in the room. The footsteps, slow and deliberate, circled her. Her breath hitched in her throat. She wanted to scream, but nothing came out. Something moved in the corner of her vision. A shadow, darker than the rest of the room. It darted toward her. Fast. Too fast. Her pulse hammered in her ears. The figure's cold breath was on her neck again. But this time, the voice was louder, sharper. "Did you really think you could escape?" Marissa's body jerked, finally breaking free from the grip of the darkness. She scrambled to her feet, but the room seemed to close in on her, the walls pressing tight. The figure was there, right in front of her, closer than before. Her back hit the wall, but the figure didn't move. It stood still, watching her, waiting. And then, in the blink of an eye, the darkness retreated. Just as suddenly as it had enveloped her, it was gone. The room, the air, the space around her, it returned to normal. But the figure was still there. It was as if it had never left. Marissa's pulse slowed, but the unease remained. "Now you know," the figure said, its voice icy. "The story doesn't end for you. It never does." She felt a cold hand graze her cheek. And then a chill ran down her spine as the figure stepped back into the shadows, fading away like a nightmare. And just like that, she was alone again. Or was she? Her fingers fumbled for the light switch. The room blinked back into the dim light. But something was different. The air felt heavier. The book, her true crime book, lay on the floor, open to the very last page, where the final sentence still stared up at her. Asterisk, the truth is always darker than the fiction. Asterisk. And now, she realized it wasn't just a story. It was her story. The room seemed to close in again. The walls felt too tight, the air too thin. Marissa's mind raced. What had just happened? Was it a dream? No. Her hands were still trembling, her heart pounding. She glanced at the book, still open on the floor. Her eyes caught the last words again. She reached down, picking it up slowly, as if the pages might burn her. Her fingers traced the print, the cold sensation of the ink against her skin, sending a shiver through her spine. The words were familiar, but they felt wrong, like they had been written just for her. The quiet hum of the streetlights outside filtered through the window, barely audible. The darkness, though, still lingered in the corners of the room. Marissa stood there, the book clenched tightly in her hands, her body rigid. What if it wasn't just a random encounter? What if this story wasn't finished yet? She turned the pages, flipping through the chapters, but something strange happened. The ink began to shift. The words blurred, twisting like smoke. She blinked, rubbed her eyes, but it didn't stop. Each page she turned was different. Familiar faces and places, now distorted. Names of people she had never seen before, written as if they belonged to her life. Her throat went dry. Her pulse raced again. It was like the book was rewriting itself. The words, they were no longer stories. They were instructions, a guide, a map. Her eyes scanned the pages in a frenzy. One name stood out, a name she recognized, her own. It was written there on the final page, alongside all the others, and beneath it an address. Her stomach churned. She stared at it for a moment, trying to convince herself it was a coincidence. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. It was the place where she had grown up, a place she hadn't thought about in years, a place she had left behind. Marissa dropped the book. It hit the floor with a soft thud. She stood frozen, her mind spiraling. The book was telling her something she didn't want to hear, but it was already too late to ignore it. She had to go, and as she stepped toward the door, a cold whisper brushed against her ear. Your story is only just beginning. Marissa's body stiffened at the sound. It was so close, the breath like ice against her skin. Her hand hovered over the door handle, but her feet refused to move. The whisper echoed in her mind, louder now. Asterisk, just beginning. Asterisk. Her thoughts raced. She had to leave, had to find out what was happening. The address, her childhood home. It was impossible to ignore, but something was holding her back. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the room. The shadows seemed to shift, moving at the edges of her vision. The book lay on the floor, open to the page with her name, and in that moment she felt it. The room wasn't empty. The presence she had felt earlier was back. A cold, oppressive weight settled in the air. She could feel its eyes on her, waiting. Her breath quickened, but she forced herself to step forward, her hand finally grasping the door handle. She twisted it, but it wouldn't budge. The lock. Something was wrong. Her fingers fumbled, panic rising in her chest. She tried again, harder this time, but the door remained stuck. Suddenly, the room grew darker. The shadows stretched and lengthened, as if they were alive, closing in on her. A sharp, echoing laugh broke the silence. It was familiar. Too familiar. Marissa's head snapped around, searching for the source. Her heart raced as she saw it. The figure. The same figure from before, standing motionless in the corner. It was smiling now, that same twisted grin. You can't leave, it said, its voice a rasp. You never really could. Marissa's hands shook, her mind reeling. She tried to scream, but the words caught in her throat. The figure stepped forward, its footsteps soundless against the floor. Closer, closer. The shadows seemed to pull away from the walls, gathering around the figure like a cloak. Don't you understand? It said, its voice softer now but colder. You're a part of the story, Marissa. Your fate is already written. The room seemed to pulse with its words. Her chest tightened, suffocating. You thought you could escape it. The figure's eyes glinted in the dim light. But you're just another chapter, another victim. The darkness wrapped around her, pulling her back, as if the room itself was swallowing her whole. Marissa's body trembled with fear, but she couldn't look away. Her mind raced to understand. Was it true? Was this all planned? The figure's laugh grew louder, echoing in the small room. And then the walls began to close in, the shadows tightening around her. Marissa's breath came faster, but the air felt thinner. She was trapped. She couldn't escape. She realized with a sickening clarity that the book had been more than a story. It had been a warning, her own warning. She wasn't just reading about the killers and the cases. She was living them. Her fate was already sealed, and there was nothing she could do to change it. The room darkened even further. Marissa's breath came in shallow, panicked gasps. She could feel the shadows pressing against her, like they were alive, suffocating her. The figure moved closer still. Its presence was overpowering, a suffocating coldness seeping into her bones. Every story needs a conclusion, it whispered, its voice low, like a cruel promise. Marissa's heart hammered in her chest, her pulse racing. The figure's eyes never left hers. It reached out, its hand cold as ice, grazing her cheek with a feather-light touch. She recoiled, the chill running through her skin. She tried to speak, but no words came. Her throat was too tight, her voice lost to the terror. The figure tilted its head, studying her. "What's the matter? You don't want to know how it ends." The laughter that followed was hollow, dark, and full of mockery. She shook her head, desperately trying to move, but her body wouldn't respond. She couldn't run. She couldn't even scream. The air seemed to tighten around her like an invisible vice. The figure's grin widened, stretching unnaturally wide. "I told you," it said softly, "you're part of the story now, and it's too late to change the ending." Marissa felt the weight of its words settle in her chest, heavy and suffocating. It wasn't just an encounter. It wasn't a random event. She had become the story. The room seemed to distort, the walls bending and warping. She could see flashes of the book in her mind, the words twisting, rearranging, as if her own fate was being written before her eyes. Her legs finally gave way, her knees hitting the floor. She couldn't escape. She couldn't wake up from this nightmare. The figure leaned closer, its breath cold against her ear. "There's no turning back, Marissa." The walls were closing in on her now, the shadows consuming every inch of space. Her mind was slipping, her sense of reality distorting. And then everything went black. A ringing silence followed. The world was still, and then a single page turned. The words on the page were hers now, her story. And the ending had already been written. The silence stretched on, suffocating, endless. Then a soft rustling broke it, a faint whisper, as if from far away. The room was no longer dark. It was completely still. Marissa's mind began to come back, piece by piece, like an awakening. Her eyes blinked open, but the air felt different, heavier. She was still on the floor, but the book was gone. She looked around, but the room was unchanged. Same worn windows, same flickering streetlight outside. Everything was still, and yet everything had shifted. A faint pressure lingered in the room, an unsettling hum beneath the surface. Marissa pushed herself up slowly, her legs unsteady. She felt detached, as if she were floating just above the ground. The walls felt too close again. The shadows seemed to twist in the corners, just beyond her sight. But there's something else, something she couldn't place. She looked down at her hands. They were trembling, but not from fear. The sensation of being watched hadn't left. It was as if someone, was waiting for her to make a move, to acknowledge it. Marissa's fingers brushed against the edge of the table, where the book had been. It wasn't there. But then she froze. A sound. A page turning. She turned quickly. The book was back, right where it had been before. But it wasn't the same book. It was different. The cover was darker now, almost black, with strange markings carved into it. Her heart raced again. She reached for it almost instinctively and opened the cover. The pages were filled with words. Her own words, written in her own handwriting. The ink was fresh, like it had been written just moments ago. Her name appeared at the top of the first page. Marissa. She flipped through, but each page was filled with more. The story unfolded in front of her, her life, her every movement. The date she had moved into the apartment. The day she'd found the true crime book. The day she had picked it up and started reading. Every detail, every moment was written. It was all there, including the parts she didn't remember, the things she didn't know. Her breath caught as she turned to the final page. It was blank, but beneath her fingertips, the ink began to appear. A sentence, scrawled across the page, slowly forming. Asterisk, the end is only the beginning. Asterisk. Her pulse quickened. The room began to fade again. Not into darkness, but into something else. Something darker, more oppressive. The shadows, the whispers, they were all around her once again. And just as the last words formed, the book snapped shut. The room was silent again. And she knew, deep down, it wasn't over. Not yet. Not ever. The silence in the room felt unnatural now, like it was holding its breath. Marissa stood still, staring at the closed book in her hands, her mind spinning, trying to grasp what had just happened. The weight of it all pressed on her chest, suffocating. Her fingers trembled as she held the book, but her grip tightened. She couldn't let it go, not after everything. The shadows, the whispers, everything was still there, lingering at the edges of her senses, just beyond reach. It was as if the room was watching her, waiting for something to happen. She turned the book over in her hands, her eyes scanning the cover. But there were no more markings, no clues, nothing but a smooth, dark surface. She slowly opened it again, her heart in her throat. The pages were blank. Her mind screamed in confusion. What is happening? She flipped through the entire book, each page empty, like a void. Her pulse quickened. It was the same book, the same twisted book that had written her story, that had become her nightmare. But now it was empty. Her breath quickened, her thoughts racing. Then it happened again. A single line appeared on the first page. Slowly, deliberately. Asterisk, you are the story now. Asterisk. The room seemed to shudder. The air grew thicker, heavier. She felt her skin crawl. The shadows gathered again, swarming around her. But this time, they were different. They were more than just dark shapes. They were alive, moving with purpose, closing in on her. She could feel their cold presence, their eyes, their hunger. Marissa backed away, heart pounding. Asterisk, no. This can't be real. This can't be happening, asterisk. But the shadows didn't stop. They pressed closer, enclosing her in their grasp. Her chest tightened. The figure was there again, the one who had haunted her. It stepped out from the swirling darkness, its eyes glowing with something cold and predatory. You thought you could escape, it whispered, but you were always part of the story. Marissa took a step back, but there was nowhere to go. The walls were closing in. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Your fate was written long before you picked up that book, the figure continued, its voice like ice. Now you're trapped. Just like the others. Marissa's head swam. She tried to run, to scream, but her legs felt like lead. The shadows wrapped around her, constricting, suffocating. Her vision blurred. And then, the figure's grin stretched wider, impossibly wide, as it leaned in close. Welcome to your ending, it said softly, as the darkness swallowed her whole. The book dropped from her hands, landing open on the floor. The last page turned, and the ink slowly bled across the paper, filling the void. Asterisk, the end is only the beginning. Asterisk, the ink on the page spread, slowly at first, like a stain that refused to stop growing. It moved with purpose, almost alive, curling around the edges of the paper, bleeding into the space where there was nothing but darkness. Marissa's mind screamed in terror, but she couldn't move. She was trapped, her body frozen, unable to escape the tightening grip of the shadows that surrounded her. The figure stood above her, watching, its cold eyes never leaving her face. You're not just part of the story, Marissa, it murmured, its voice low, almost affectionate. You are the story. Every moment, every chapter, every word. It leaned in closer, its breath like ice against her skin. And you will never escape. The darkness seemed to pulse with each word, a living, breathing thing. Her chest tightened, her heart pounding painfully in her ears. She tried to scream, to fight back, but the shadows were everywhere, swallowing her, pulling her deeper into the void. The book was still open on the floor, its pages now covered in ink. The words were writing themselves. Marissa couldn't tear her gaze away from the page as the final sentence began to form. Asterisk, you're trapped in the story, and the story has no end. Asterisk. The shadows pressed closer, suffocating her, wrapping around her, until she could no longer tell where they began and she ended. Her mind spun, her thoughts unraveling. She knew. She understood now. This wasn't just a nightmare. This was her reality. The figure smiled, its lips curling up in a grotesque mockery of a grin. The more you struggle, it whispered, the more you become part of it. The walls of the room seemed to shift, folding in on themselves. The floor warped beneath her feet. The book's pages turned again, faster now, as if eager to reach its inevitable end. Marissa felt the pull of the ink. It was like gravity, impossible to resist, drawing her in. The words on the page were hers, but they weren't her own. They were predestined. She could hear it now, the sound of the ink flowing, shifting, like whispers carried by the wind. The story was being written around her, consuming her. And just as she thought she couldn't bear it anymore, the ink surged, and the world around her cracked open. The last thing she saw before everything shattered was the book, its pages finally stopping on one last sentence. And it was her name written in bold, cold ink. Marissa. And the story was not over. Not yet. It had only just begun. The world shattered around her. Reality itself seemed to tear apart, unraveling into endless fragments of shadow and ink. Marissa gasped for air, but the darkness seemed to choke her, pulling her deeper into the void. She couldn't see, couldn't feel. It was as if time had stopped. But then, the words on the page whispered through her mind, clear as day. Asterisk, the story is never truly finished. It's always waiting, always writing itself. Asterisk. Her eyes snapped open. She was back in the room she thought she had escaped. The shadows lingered, but they were different now, shifting, changing, as if they were aware of her every movement. Marissa stood in the center, her hands shaking, her heart pounding in her chest. She was no longer alone. The figure was there, too, but it wasn't the same. It had changed, evolved. Its eyes burned with a feral, twisted hunger, and its grin stretched wider, impossibly wide. "You didn't learn, did you?" the figure whispered, its voice like a cold wind. Marissa took a step back, but the shadows moved with her, following her every motion, cornering her, trapping her in the same prison she had fought to escape. She had thought the story was over, but it wasn't. It was still being written, and she was a part of it. The figure's hand reached out, and its cold fingers brushed her cheek, sending a shiver down her spine. "Your fate was sealed the moment you opened the book," it said softly. "You belong to the story now." Marissa's breath quickened. She could feel the weight of the words press down on her, suffocating her. Her pulse raced, and her mind screamed for escape, but it was useless. The walls of the room seemed to stretch, pulling her deeper into the suffocating space. The book was back in front of her, open and waiting, as though it had never left. The pages turned again, and the words were no longer just ink. They were alive. Asterisk, Marissa, your story has just begun. Asterisk. Her eyes widened in horror as the ink seemed to shift and move across the pages, the words dancing and shifting into something new, something she could not control. She reached out, desperate to stop it, but her hands passed right through the pages as if they weren't even real. The room trembled, the darkness swirling like a storm around her. And the figure laughed, low and cruel. "Remember this, Marissa," it said, its voice echoing through the room. "The story never ends. It only restarts." The world around her cracked apart once more. The story was far from over, and in that moment Marissa knew she would never escape. She was bound to the story, and it was waiting for her always. Forever the darkness closed in tighter, wrapping around her like a suffocating shroud. Her heart beat louder, each thud a desperate plea for freedom. Marissa's eyes darted around, searching for any escape, but the shadows were everywhere, pulsing, shifting, alive. The figure watched her from the corner, its grin widening with every passing second, a twisted satisfaction in its gaze. "You're part of it now," the figure whispered, its voice slithering through her mind. "There's no escape from the story. You can't change what's been written." The walls seemed to breathe with the rhythm of her pulse, and the room itself seemed to fade and distort, warping into something darker, something more oppressive. The book, still open in her hands, seemed to grow heavier, as if the weight of its pages was pressing down on her. Her breath quickened. She tried to drop the book, to push it away, but it clung to her hands like it was part of her skin. She stared down at the pages. The ink twisted, curling around the words, changing them, shifting them into new forms, new horrors. Asterisk, you can never outrun the story. Asterisk. Marissa's vision blurred, her body trembling as the ink seemed to spread from the pages, flowing out and around her like dark tendrils, pulling her into its grip. The figure's voice echoed in her ears, its words a constant presence in her mind. "You wanted the truth, didn't you?" it hissed. "You wanted to know what was real. But the truth, it's a story, just like everything else." She could feel the shadows creeping closer, the edges of the room vanishing into blackness. Her mind screamed, desperate to wake up, to break free, but it was useless. She was trapped. In the story, in the never-ending nightmare. The ink on the pages began to form new words, words she hadn't seen before, words that spoke directly to her. Asterisk, the end is only a beginning. For the next chapter, asterisk. Marissa's chest tightened, her breaths coming faster, panic rising within her. She wanted to scream, but her voice caught in her throat, stifled by the crushing weight of the shadows. The book's pages turned again, faster this time, as if the story was accelerating, as if it was consuming everything in its path. She couldn't stop it. The figure stepped forward, its face inches from hers, its eyes glowing with a sickening light. "You're not just trapped in this story, Marissa," it said, its voice smooth and cold. "You are the story, and it will never let you go." The darkness around her seemed to pulse in rhythm with her racing heart. The room twisted and warped again, the walls shifting, folding into themselves, until there was nothing but the swirling blackness. And then the book closed, the pages stopped turning, and Marissa was alone. Or at least, she thought she was. But the whispers began again, soft at first, then growing louder, filling the room with the sound of voices. Hundreds of voices, each one telling their own story. Her story. The one that would never end. The one that would keep writing itself. Forever the voices swirled around her, growing louder with every passing second. Each word, each whisper, echoed in her mind, a constant, unrelenting rhythm. Asterisk, you can't escape. You belong to the story. Asterisk. Marissa's chest tightened as the whispers became a cacophony of sound, drowning out everything else. The walls of the room twisted and pulsed, the darkness consuming the edges of her vision. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The shadows clung to her like an oppressive weight, pulling her deeper into the void. And then the figure was there again. But this time it wasn't just standing in the corner. It was all around her, its presence suffocating. Its voice, now a deep, bone-chilling growl, filled her ears. "The story is everything, Marissa," it said, each word dripping with malice. "You thought you could escape, but you're not the one in control. You never were." Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat louder than the last. "I'm trapped." Her mind screamed it, but her body refused to move, her limbs frozen by fear, by the weight of the realization. The book, now closed in her hands, pulsed with an unnatural energy. It was alive. It had always been alive, and now it was pulling her in. With a violent jerk, the book flew open again, its pages turning wildly. The words blurred and danced across the pages, shifting and rearranging, as if the story itself was rewriting. Marissa could feel the ink as it began to seep into her skin, crawling beneath the surface, marking her as part of its tale. Asterisk, this is your fate, Marissa. Asterisk. The figure's eyes glowed with an unholy light, its grin impossibly wide. You will never be free. Not now. Not ever. And then, the room seemed to tear apart once more. Reality splintered, the edges of the world breaking into shards of shadow and ink. Marissa screamed, but no sound escaped her lips. The shadows closed in, wrapping around her, pulling her deeper into the page. The story had already written her end, and now she was trapped inside it, forever. The final words filled the room as the darkness swallowed her whole. Asterisk, the story never ends. It only consumes. Asterisk. And everything went dark. There was nothing but darkness. Complete and suffocating silence. Marissa couldn't feel the weight of the book anymore. Couldn't feel the shadows clinging to her skin. For a moment, she thought, perhaps hoped, that she had finally escaped. But then the words started again. Soft at first, a mere whisper, like a distant echo. Then louder, clearer. Asterisk, you thought it was over. Asterisk. The voice was familiar, yet alien. The same voice that had taunted her from the shadows, now speaking directly in her mind. She tried to move, to break free from the grip of the darkness, but her limbs were heavy, like they were made of stone. Her breath hitched in her chest. It wasn't over. The cold grip of reality returned, pulling her back. The void split open, and before she could even comprehend what was happening, she was falling. Falling through space, through time, through the very fabric of the story itself. She fell endlessly, through a spiral of ink, as the words twisted and reformed around her. The stories she had read, the cases she had obsessed over, all merged together. Faces she'd never seen, voices she'd never heard, all swirled around her, becoming one, merging into the darkness. She tried to scream, but the air felt thick, suffocating. Her throat closed, her voice silenced by the overwhelming force of the world that surrounded her. And then a light flickered, a dim, flickering glow that was barely visible against the endless void. Her heart skipped a beat. The book. She knew, without even seeing it, that it was there. The book had returned, and in its pages, every word, every line, every sentence, her life was written. Written in ink, dark and permanent. She couldn't stop it, couldn't tear the pages, couldn't erase the ink. The book was her. She was the story. It wasn't just a tale. It was her fate. The voice spoke again, this time clearer, more triumphant. Asterisk, you are the next chapter, Marissa, and you will never, ever escape. Asterisk. The light grew stronger, the inked pages swirling around her like a tornado. Marissa could feel it now, feel the story pulling her, weaving her into it, like a thread being sewn into the fabric of the narrative. She tried to resist, tried to fight, but her body felt like it was being torn apart. The words wrapped around her, coiling tighter, suffocating, until she was back in the room, back in the same room she had fled from, the shadows closing in once more. The book was there, open in front of her. The words had already begun. Asterisk, you can't run from the story. It's inside you now. Asterisk. Marissa reached out, her fingers brushing the ink on the page, and she realized in that moment, with a chilling clarity, that she would never leave. Not as long as the book still existed. Not as long as the story was still writing. She was part of it, forever. And the ink, the shadows, the book, they would never let her go. Because the story never ends, the room was suffocating. The shadows closed in, tighter now, wrapping around her, pulling her toward the open pages. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of voices, each one a reminder of her inescapable fate. Marissa's hand hovered over the book, trembling, but it wasn't just the fear that made her hand shake. It was the realization, the understanding that this nightmare was her reality now. She had become the story, and the story was endless. Each page she had turned, each step she had taken, had led her here, to this place, to this moment, a prisoner in her own narrative. But as her fingers grazed the ink, something shifted. A jolt of energy passed through her fingertips, like electricity surging through her veins. The words on the page began to blur again. The letters twisted and turned, as if they had a life of their own, fighting against her touch, rewriting themselves with malicious intent. Marissa recoiled, but it was too late. "You can't escape," the voice echoed, louder now, almost deafening. "Asterisk, you belong to the story, and it will never let you go. Asterisk." The book flipped open by itself, the pages turning so rapidly that the words became a blur of motion. It was as though the very fabric of reality was being torn apart by the force of its presence. She tried to tear herself away, to escape the grip of the book, but it was impossible. The shadows that had once been oppressive now pulsed with a rhythm, like a heartbeat, drawing her closer to the pages. Her breath came in shallow gasps, the room spinning around her, the weight of inevitability pressing down with each passing second. She could feel it. The story was rewriting itself. She could sense it. Every time she fought back, every time she tried to break free, the narrative adjusted. It shifted, bending to her resistance, trapping her more tightly. The figure reappeared, stepping out of the swirling shadows, its eyes glowing with a twisted satisfaction. "It's too late," it whispered. "There's no escape from the story. It's already been written, and now you are part of it." Marissa's body shook with terror, but her mind, though clouded, knew the truth. She was no longer just a reader, an observer. She was the next chapter, and there was no turning back. The pages continued to turn, faster now, each word more suffocating than the last. The figure leaned in, its breath cold against her ear. "You will live the story forever," it said. "You are the story. Every word, every twist, every ending." She closed her eyes, trying to block out the overwhelming darkness, but the ink seeped into her mind, into her soul. She was the story, and the story would never end. Not for her. Not ever. The darkness around Marissa began to pulse with an eerie rhythm, like the beating of a heart, slow, deliberate, inevitable. Her hands shook as they hovered over the pages of the book, the ink still wet and shifting, crawling across the paper like a living thing. Every word, every line felt like a weight pressing down on her chest, suffocating her with the realization that she was trapped. The figure stood before her, its form looming, its presence unbearable. Its eyes glowed with a cold, knowing light, as if it had seen the very end of time and found her written there, inescapable. "You think you can change it," the figure whispered, its voice both familiar and foreign, like 1,000 voices merging into one. "But you can't. You were always part of this. You always will be." Marissa's heart pounded. The walls around her seemed to press in, and she could hear the faintest rustling, like the turning of pages. She wasn't just in a room anymore. She was inside the book, inside the very narrative that controlled her fate. Her eyes flew to the open pages once more. The words were no longer just written. They were alive, twisting and rearranging, pulling her in. She could feel the ink seep into her skin, the letters branding themselves into her soul. The figure moved closer, its shadow expanding, enveloping her. "You wanted to know the truth, didn't you? You wanted to be part of something real. Well, now you are." and there's no escape from it. Marissa opened her mouth to speak, to scream, to demand a way out, but no sound came. Her body felt frozen, bound by the very words that held her captive. And then she understood. The story wasn't just written on the pages. It was written into her. She was the story, and the story was her. She could never be separated from it, never leave it behind. The figure's grin widened. Welcome to your eternity, Marissa. Welcome to the endless pages. The room cracked apart, and she felt herself being pulled into the ink. The darkness consumed her, swallowed her whole, and she was lost forever as part of the story that would never, ever end. The book closed, the final page turning, and everything faded to black. The oppressive silence hung in the air, thick and unyielding, as the room settled back into its unnerving stillness. The shadows seemed to pause, holding their breath, waiting. The figure was gone, no longer standing in the corner, no longer lurking in the edges of her mind. Marissa blinked, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The book lay in front of her, closed now, its cover smooth, its weight less oppressive than it had been before. But she knew better than to think it was over. She could still feel it, the pull, the invisible thread that connected her to the pages, to the endless narrative that had swallowed her. Her hands, trembling at her sides, reached for the book one last time, not out of compulsion, but out of sheer need to understand, to finish it, to end it. The moment her fingers brushed the cover, the air shifted, and the room seemed to breathe once more. But this time, it wasn't the suffocating, oppressive feeling that had filled the space earlier. It was lighter, almost freeing. She opened the book, half expecting the ink to surge forth again, to drag her into its spiraling chaos. But the pages were blank, completely, utterly blank. Marissa stared at the empty pages, her breath catching in her throat. The silence was profound, not threatening, but peaceful. The book was waiting for her, but it no longer held her captive. The story had come to its final, unexpected conclusion. She closed the book gently, a sense of relief washing over her. For the first time in what felt like forever, she was free. She stood up slowly, cautiously, as though expecting the shadows to return, the book to rewrite itself, to pull her back into its grasp. But nothing happened. The walls around her no longer pressed in. The darkness no longer swarmed. The book was finished. She was finished. The story was done. Marissa took one last look at the room, the space where it had all unfolded, and stepped toward the door. As her hand touched the doorknob, she felt a shift in the air, a quiet whisper. Asterisk, the end is only the beginning. Asterisk. But this time, it didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a promise. And this time, Marissa was ready to step away, knowing that she had finally closed the page on the story. For good.